So that gives you a little flavour of disappearing acts. Do you want to start?
So the background for disappearing acts, we did some research and development, and we started off with this idea of what dance would look like in low light conditions, as in so dark that you couldn't quite see what was happening, and how much your mind filled in and choreographed or added to the choreography. We did quite a bit of research with that, and then found out that at really low light, where it takes like 10 minutes for your eyes to adapt, it started to become quite interesting. However, most theatres have got big exit signs, so we can never achieve those conditions. However, it started a theme, and the theme was disappearance or absence and presence. And we did develop quite a lot of lighting, flashing lights that would light up something and disappear, so you get after images. And we took that theme into a lot of different areas where we'd have, obviously with the choreography, which Elle will talk about, but also with the props. We had a set of shoes, which they're very iconic. When you put shoes down as if somebody's left them, they're so suggestive of the person who was there, but there's a presence and absence inferred by that. And also a mobile phone put there where you hear somebody's voice, but you never see them. And at times, you might have seen the audiences in a round on chairs. Sometimes the lights would go down and reappear, and some audience members, plants, would disappear, and you'd just be left with the empty chairs. So presence and absence going throughout the piece.
So I think we started with darkness, and then I said to Nick, I find it a little bit hard to choreograph completely in the dark. So then it became more about disappearance, and as he says, presence and absence, but also the idea of loss and death became quite prominent through it. And there was a thread that was also looking at, I suppose, dark political times. And Nick mentioned this already. Disappearing acts kind of employs a disappearance as a performative strategy. So we had a series of disappearing acts that were kind of announced very formally through the piece, and that also gave it a structure. And they were borrowing a little bit from Victorian magic acts. So it wasn't really about the magic of the disappearance, but more about the act itself. So that kind of led us through, and you saw there were the shoes walking, Michael Jackson's shoes. So that was a disappearing act number 4, I think. Dead man walking. There was another disappearing act that you saw that Luke and Julie had their eyes closed and the audience disappeared. So that was a different kind of act. So these sort of punctuated the show. And there was even a disappearing act that disappeared, so it was never announced. And I guess it sort of, in a very simplistic way, it looks at how all performance, or the basic premise for performance, is now you see me, now you don't. So that kind of play with hide and seek is at the root of so much of performance. So it kind of accentuated that. And as you saw, it was performed in this round situation, very close to the audience, so a very proximal relation to the audience. And in a similar way to Gravity Shift, it has this kind of visceral relationship. As an audience, you really feel the performers. And especially because the dancing, as you saw, is quite fast and quite vigorous. So when the dancers are there and then they suddenly whoosh past and disappear, you really feel their absence in a kind of body sense. So not as an intellectual idea, but you really kind of are feeling it in your body. And I guess I was very interested also in this boundary, this shifting between in and out, as a very permeable kind of boundary. So something that can shift and change. And I think for me, that's got a sort of a really important element of quite a lot of my work. That idea of moving in and out gives you that sense of presence and absence. But also I think it talks about how, for me, what's wonderful about dance is that you can be more than. So how you might be seen in the everyday, in dance you can have other layers of your identity somehow. You can be other things. So there's this kind of boundary that is more open or more porous. And I think it also reflects the position, I suppose, of me as a choreographer that's in between. So both inside the work and outside the work. And I guess in a more personal way, I'm an immigrant. I come from Israel originally. So I think that position really reflects my own feeling of being both inside and outside, but somehow in both cultures. And I suppose being liminal, being on the edge or on the fringes of something, whether that's gender or identity in the sense of cultural identity, I think often gives you that possibility to comment on things, both from the inside and from the outside. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of disappearance and movement, and that became really clear in the piece. So movement is always disappearing. We're always moving through. So there's always an act of displacement when you move. And we always move from the present into the past. So any movement you make goes from now into what has been. So that is the very essence of movement. And so the piece really kind of explored that, and I think made it hopefully very felt because of that closeness to the dancers. And I think this idea of the audience being both in and out, and the dancers being able to watch each other and watch the audience, and the audience seeing themselves, also makes this idea of presence really felt. So unlike what Nick showed with Gravity Shift, where or in traditional theatre, where the theatre is the audience is anonymous and in the dark, they can't afford to be anonymous in this situation. So their presence becomes integral to the piece, and they're complicit in it to some degree.
Yeah, they're on stage, aren't they? And they're in the round, and everything's happening around and through them. So you can't avoid being aware of yourself.
And I think, so that became, again, something to do with presence and disappearance. I was going to talk a little bit about the text. So we worked again with Wendy Houston. She's actually based in Yorkshire. She's in Hebden Bridge, and she's a fantastic maker in her own right. And she wrote a bunch of text, again, a kind of meditation on disappearance. So Nick mentioned the phone, and that's sort of in the piece, there's these prologues and epilogues that I sort of announce on the phone. So I'm sort of this disappeared choreographer, or a presence that's felt but isn't quite there. And so in that prologue I say things like, what a big pleasure it is to have this opportunity, this once in a lifetime chance to be so close to you all, and yet so far. So it really plays with this idea of distance again. And the prologue it really mocks the choreographer, where she just keeps quoting famous quotes that are said by everyone and are really ununique. But it's all about trying to say goodbye, or the idea of slowly disappearing. So it goes on and on and on. It's quite a long goodbye, which eventually just fades off. And then there was another text which was in that video, which we called the quiz show, where Wendy wrote a bunch of questions like, which words were taken out of the Oxford Dictionary this year, and the contestants have to sort of do it in movement somehow. Or what if a person standing in front of you, standing in front of you suddenly lies prone? What do we think of that person? Or we think of that person as what? So it started to talk about death in that way, and loss. And of course, the contestants can't actually answer those questions around disappearance. And in terms of the movement, they used a lot of gesture, but then towards the end, they almost start to trace, to kind of mark the answers. So the movement in itself becomes, disappears.
So they're trying to sort of hopelessly sort of accommodate for that,
for the lack of
they can't say anything, so they're like, they don't know what the answer is, so they're just doing some gesture.
And I guess the lights as well, Nick mentioned this kind of after image, but also what I think it illustrated is, so you would see an image of a dancer, the light would flick on and then would flick off, and then the next time you see the dancer, they're somewhere else. So the idea that movement passes, or the passing and disappearance of movement, becomes really abrupt and clear in your vision.
I'll say something about the lights, actually. Yeah, I made the lights. They're very good. We use these strobe lights, but they're built into the road marking lights, so they've got associations with them. And we quite like this idea, slight tension of warning that you associate with the positioning of these flashing lights. And quite often, when you go down the motorway, you see a lot of them in order. Sometimes they're in sequence, sometimes they're not. They're random sequence, and they're half illuminating the space. And there's a odd association with them. They're associated with an accident, something tragic, something odd. And they were also portable wireless things, so they could be picked up by the performers and moved around like building blocks. So they became part of the environment that the performers were in, but at the same time, they showed the performers or didn't show the performers. So there's quite a nice play with those things. So they became sort of construction blocks for the set.
And also sound. They played sound.
And they did sound as well. You see, do two things. Marvellous.
And then in terms of the movement, I guess, the choreography, so we played a lot with idea of absence. So all of the movement sequences that you saw are made with the idea of absence. So it's either imagining objects in the room that you're moving around, or it's creating this kind of negative space where I'm going to demonstrate on it, where you make a space that someone can escape from or appear into. And that was the basic construction for all the movement. So then the movement itself is infused with this idea of absence throughout.